Hello. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the different compromises that were made at the Constitutional Convention, as well as the Constitution itself that was written at the convention, and the struggle that followed over the issue of ratification. So as we saw in the last lesson, when the delegates in Philadelphia first met, they were discussing possible changes to the Articles of Confederation. And instead, what they decided to do was to get rid of the Articles completely and replace it with a new Constitution based on the Virginia Plan, which was written by Virginia delegate James Madison. This Virginia Plan called for a new Constitution with 3 branches and a bicameral or 2-house legislature, and a legislature that was based on a population. In other words, the larger the population of a state, the more lawmakers that state got to send to the legislature. Well, this was very upsetting to states with smaller populations. So while Virginia might get 10 lawmakers in the legislature because it has the biggest population, Delaware or Rhode Island might get 1 or 2 each because they have such small populations. So George Washington, who was the president of the convention, formed a committee that was led by Benjamin Franklin, and the job of this committee was to come up with some kind of compromise that would satisfy both sides. And the compromise that they created is now known as the Great Compromise. It was created by a delegate from Connecticut named Roger Sherman. So this is sometimes called the Connecticut Compromise, but we're going to go with Great Compromise. It said that under the Virginia Plan, the legislature is bicameral. Bicameral, of course, means that the legislature has 2 houses. So he said one of these houses should be based on population. So the lower house, what we now call the House of Representatives, would be based on population. So the bigger the state's population, the more lawmakers that state gets to send to the House of Representatives. And this is the way that it still is today. For example, California, which I know did not exist at this time in history, or at least was not part of the United States at this time in history, but California currently in 2020 has 53 members in the House of Representatives because it has the biggest population in the United States. On the other hand, a smaller state like Rhode Island only has 2 members of the House of Representatives because it has such a small population. However, according to Sherman's compromise, the upper house, which we now call the Senate, would be based on equal representation. And in this case, each state, no matter the size, would have 2 senators. So, in the House, it's based on population. The bigger the state population, the more lawmakers. But in the Senate, each state receives 2 lawmakers. And in order for a law to be created, it must be approved by both houses. So, even though the smaller states can be overpowered in the House, they have the ability to block a bill in the Senate. And this is not exactly what each side wanted, but it was enough to satisfy both sides. Now that it has been decided that the House of Representatives will be based on population, the next question is, who should be considered part of that population. Now, of course, the people that they have in mind when they ask this question is slaves. Now, the writers of the Constitution managed to talk about slavery without ever using the word slave. They would usually use the term other persons. But this was a hot topic at the Constitutional Convention. Should slaves be counted as part of the population? The South said yes, because they had a larger slave population. And this, of course, would give them more representatives in the House. The North, on the other hand, who had fewer slaves, and make no mistake, slavery still existed in that area, but they had fewer slaves. They said, no, you should not be able to get more representatives simply because you own more slaves. And so it was finally decided that 3/5, or 60%, of the slaves in each state would be counted for the purpose of representation. So the South, even though slaves have no legal or political rights, they were not able to vote, they were not able to run for or hold office. 3/5 of them would be counted for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. On the other hand, that same number, 3/5, 60%, would also be counted for purposes of property taxes. And so Southerners would only be paying 60% of the value of their slaves in property taxes. Once these two issues were settled, once it had been decided that the House of Representatives would be based on population, the Senate would receive equal representation, and the issue of slavery and representation was settled, the convention continued forward. They added two branches, the executive branch and the judicial branch, and the Constitution itself was signed by the delegates on September 17th, 1787, which is still remembered to this day as Constitution Day. Now, something I want to point out is the opening line of the preamble, which is essentially the introduction to the Constitution, reads, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union." I want you to think about that word, union. Now, the government that they were replacing, of course, was the Articles of Confederation. Confederation is not a word that we use very often, but it essentially means friendship. So, under the Articles of Confederation, the United States was a group of friends. Friends can be close, but friends are not always permanent. Friends can drift apart, and friendships can be ended very easily. But a union, that's a word that brings to mind a marriage. A marriage is much more difficult to end than a friendship. So what this Constitution has done is it has created a new government that is going to bind the 13 states together as one united nation.